out of 10. And Greg could say, well, it's great that you feel that way, but it's misguided because the purpose that you have identified in your life is the wrong one. And so to me, the important question is not so much whether you subjectively report feeling like you have purpose in life, but whether that purpose is grounded in something real and true.
Yeah, so I think that your answer right now is the reason why you think some of these questions are unanswerable.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if you adopt that frame, you'll never know.
But I don't think they're unanswerable.
Okay, let me just finish. Okay, so my first experience of this, right, is that first of all, there is a subjective barometer, like how do we know whether we have purpose? Maybe we listen to other people, but there is some sort of internal sense of this. And this is where the science becomes really important, because if you look at people who have like a history of trauma or something, what you tend to find is that there are certain like neurobiological things that can happen to you that will literally affect the parts of your brain that are able to detect purpose. So this is sort of like a subjective experience. And I think the way that, and I love your emphasis on mechanism, and I think this is what, in my opinion, science and spirituality can really add, is they add the how, right? They add like, why is it that one person has purpose and another person doesn't have purpose? So first thing is that in my experience and the way that I operate, I'm not saying it's correct, it's effective in terms of helping people move the needle on reducing suicidality, improving resilience, giving them a reason to wake up in the morning. Like it tends to work. And it's not just me, it's that there's a bunch of, methodologies that we have in psychotherapy and stuff like that that accomplish these kinds of things, that there's some internal sense of purpose. Now, what I think surprises a lot of people is that there are two ways that you increase that sense of purpose. The first is a bucket of things that are kind of counterintuitive. And this is where we also have to understand that purpose correlates with certain other things in life. So if I feel like I am in control of my life, then my sense of purpose will increase. Those two things are correlated. It's not clear whether it's one thing that manifests in two ways or it's probably two discrete things because there's some subtlety there. But just as a very simple example, if you take someone who feels out of control in life and you help them get control of their life, and there's a really great example of this, which is something called passive challenges versus active challenges. So there's a fascinating research on anxiety that shows that if you're someone in life whose life is happening to you, like you wake up one day and then like your boss wants you to come in for work and you have to pay rent at the end of the month and like you're logging onto Tinder and people aren't responding to you, life is controlling the direction that you move. And people feel overwhelmed by this and they want freedom, they want control. What they end up doing is they wish that they didn't have these things. So they run away from these problems. So passive challenges are challenges that life imposes upon you that you didn't sign up for. Then there's something really fascinating, which is your sense of control in life does not correlate just with the passive challenges. It correlates with the ratio of passive challenges to active challenges. Active challenges are things that you choose to do that are difficult. So this is really fascinating, but if you're getting bodied by life in three different directions, the solution to that is not run away from those problems. It's actually to wake up and start to push yourself in a particular direction. I want to do this instead. If you want to learn how to like read, learn philosophy, start studying philosophical texts, as you start to take on more, which is very counterintuitive because when most people feel overwhelmed, they don't feel like they can do more. The exact solution is to take on more active challenges. Mm-hmm. Then you have some sense of control in life. And once your ratio of active challenges to passive challenges is more evened out, this does something really cool. It gives you a sense that I'm no longer out of control. Mm-hmm. Once you feel like you're no longer out of control, this is the really cool thing, then your capacity to deal with the stuff that life throws at you actually improves. Mm-hmm. So there's this is just one example of like one scientific neurobiological principle that has some psychology associated with where you can do particular things mm-hmm. to give yourself a sense of direction in life. Mm-hmm. Now, some of the stuff around worship and spiritual practice, that can do it too. But I think that usually what I tend to see is that, if someone is lost in life, you can sort of answer it by these big questions. You can sort of think about this sort of transcendental purpose, which I'm happy to talk about. But I think there's a lot of like little stuff that you can do.
Yeah.
And as you implement these things, the sense of purpose in your life, your internal lived experience of feeling out of control will change.
Let me offer a few thoughts if I could. One, I want to speak to something that you said, Alex, that I just want to offer a caution about. When we talk about motivation, the motivation for something, we sometimes confuse that with justification. So someone might say to me, as an atheist, for example, well, you're a Christian because you were born in America. If you were born in Saudi Arabia, you wouldn't be a Christian, you'd be a Muslim. Of course, that's irrelevant to the question of whether Islam or Christianity or some other religion is true. It doesn't speak to that. It speaks to psychology, okay? And the fact is that if the atheist was born in Saudi Arabia, he wouldn't be an atheist either, likely. The key question is what motivates people, for example, to think about purpose, death, maybe a fear of death. That might be a motivation. The question is whether the place they land in answering the question has any objective truth to it or not. It could be that there is a God and that there is an afterlife. And facing death does give comfort to that. I should say, when facing death, you have comfort because there is a God and there's something that you're going to. It's closer communion with Him. Okay. Just because you're motivated by death doesn't mean that your belief about the afterlife is somehow an error.
I just wanted to add something in here. So I think part of the reason I've also convened you guys to have this conversation today is because I've got several people in my life that are, I can literally lay out the personas, but I've got one particular friend who's between 35 and 40 years old, living in Dubai, living in a glass box, freelancer. So he wakes up in the morning, his bed is there, he then works there, then goes back to bed. He's single, no kids. In his life at the moment, he said to me that he can't get out of bed anymore. He feels stuck. And then about 6 months after, out of the blue, it turns out, without telling any of us, and we're his best friends, he's flown to America, he's been baptized, he's a Christian. Suddenly his life has purpose and meaning again. He's a completely different person. And this individual never, ever, he would be the last person that you'd think would be religious. Got another friend, female, just over 30 years old, doesn't have kids, freelance, works at home. When I asked her what her meaning and purpose in life, she said to me she wants to get to having 200 plants she can water. She names all of them. She then told me a week after she's in therapy because she feels lost and stuck in life. And so much of the central point why I've been motivated to have this conversation is it appears to me, and I haven't nailed this hypothesis yet, that freedom, independence, be your own boss, the decline in people having children, the glamorization of, as you said at the very beginning, like, you know, do it yourself, do it your way, is failing people in some way. Mm-hmm. And that actually the push for independence was in some way some kind of lie. I actually also went through the same new atheist baptism that you went through. And I read all those books at 18 years old, and 2 years I was debating dog walkers on the street about God. I was such a staunch atheist. But I now find myself in a position where I'm almost back to being curious again, because it feels like independence wasn't the answer.
Good.
So just wanted to reframe.
You should be curious. I think people need tasks. I think that purpose is intimately tied up with the idea of task to fulfill. That's why people tend to find meaning in projects which are not completed yet. In fact, Pascal writes quite compellingly about this when he writes about boredom, and he imagines a gambler, someone who enjoys gambling, and says, well, why is this person gambling? Because they're doing this thing with the chance of winning some money. Okay, so why don't you just give them the money? Just take the gambler and give him all the money that he could possibly receive without playing the game. And he won't be very fulfilled, even though he's getting ostensibly what he was trying to get. No, that wouldn't be fulfilling because he enjoys the gambling. Okay, says Pascal, then let him play the game, but make it such that he'll never actually win the money, but he gets to keep playing the game. And he's not going to be very fulfilled by that either. That's also going to be completely pointless. And so Pascal noticed that what you kind of need to avoid boredom, and I suppose to imbue your life with purpose, at least in this analogy, is some kind of task to fulfill that you haven't fulfilled yet, that you don't know if you're going to fulfill, that you believe will bring you fulfillment when you get it, but you haven't got it yet. That's why I think religion does it really well, because it's the definition of something which you don't have now, which you can strive for, which when you get, you believe will be fulfilling.
So I love these examples because actually we know exactly what's going on in that thought experiment, right? So now there's so many advances in neuroscience that we understand why people gamble, right? So we understand that giving someone money will satisfy a gambler in one of two cases. And I've seen this. I've worked with people who are professional poker players. Some people, what we describe motivation is actually like a dozen different things going on in your brain. So if you were a professional poker player in poker, and I've literally worked with professional poker players who had no meaning in life. It's so funny. I'm thinking about a particular person. And then, achieved a certain financial goal, that's why they play poker. So if your motivation is that I'm playing poker because I have a skill that I'm using to get money, if that is your internal motivation, that is going to come from certain circuits in your brain. It's going to come from places like your frontal lobe. Now, as Pascal pointed out, if you give the average person who gambles money, what are they going to do with it? They're going to gamble more, right? So that means that their motivation is coming from something more closer to the nucleus accumbens, a random reinforcement schedule. Maybe they're trying to suppress amygdala emotions. So we actually can look at that example and we can understand why each of those things happens. And then the most beautiful thing is that there is absolutely a scenario where someone can gamble and never win. And they can absolutely have purpose. So this is where, I know that sounds insane, but if you look at some of these things from the Zen tradition, right? So these are practices that have no purpose, to act with no meaning whatsoever. And the beautiful thing about that is as you explore that sort of angle, and there's sort of a neuroscience perspective to this as well, is that if you really think about it, you're saying, okay, so people invest in this purpose, or in this purpose-seeking thing like religion, with the idea that I'll find payoff at the end. Is that what you were saying earlier?
I'm saying something a bit different. What I was going to go on to say is to point out that, and bear in mind, this comes from a part of Pascal's Pensée, which is titled Man Without God. He goes on to discuss man with God. But I look at the development of the human species and our particular proclivities. Lewis makes this argument from desire that you mentioned. Why do we have a desire for food? Well, because there is actually food to have. The evolutionary biologist says the reason that we develop hunger is because those who didn't died. And if you don't have some sense of hunger, you're not going to seek out food and you will die. And so it just so happens that those who develop this feeling of hunger will be more likely to survive, and therefore hunger is a part of our human condition. Well, such is meaning. If you have two isolated communities, one of whom says, I just don't care, whatever, man. No interest in having children, no interest in building societies, legal systems, constitutions, whatever the case, moral systems, none of it. They just don't care. Nihilists. They're not even going to have children. That society will die out. Another society, which just so happens to perhaps delusion, like in an exercise of delusion, just develop this inexplicable feeling. And of course, this evolves over time and starts with essentially the kind of random mutation of ideas that works on the genetic level in evolution. They call it memetics, when it's ideas rather than genes. The society which just ends up developing this idea that actually, I can't quite explain why, but I just have this drive towards building a society and engaging in legal justice and moral systems and kind of, they're just more likely to survive. So we end up with this sense, this drive within us that we can't explain, and yet we have. So imagine for the majority of our evolutionary history what it was like. Every single day you woke up and you did not know if you were going to have a roof over your head. You didn't know if you were going to have food to eat. You had to go out and you had to hunt it. You had to go and find it every single day. The game reset. And so I would imagine that those lives were probably quite meaningful, at least in the sense that I don't think there will have been many existential crises on a day-to-day, because the purpose was quite clear. And like Pascal's gambler, they had a task that they think will fulfill them when they get it, and they don't know whether it's going to be fulfilled. So what's happened today? Well, now we've been given the money without the game. We've got houses, we've got food, we can go next door and get some water, get some food from all over the planet, Like that's it, that you've got the money without the game. So what do people do in the modern situation when they find that their life is a bit meaningless? They start intentionally doing things which are difficult. They start doing ice baths. They start exercising. They start going into a room just to physically exert themselves in order to sort of build muscle and whatnot, like on purpose, for its own sake. Why? Because today we've got the money without the game. So people are going out and seeking the game without the money. They're going and doing the ice baths and the gym. Whereas the truly meaningful life is one in which you are playing the game in the service of getting the goal. That is why I think that, literally just seeking out those things, I think that there's a reason why they have a psychological impact. It's not as simple as just like, oh, well, if you go to the gym, it releases endorphins and makes you feel good. It's like, let's think a bit deeper than that. What's actually going on? People are seeking out the game without the money. Crucially, I've talked about this as a death-denying pursuit, right? The idea that the things that you engage in here, at least in terms of grand projects like religion and society, are, even if just subconsciously, an exercise in the denial of death. What would that mean? It means that if you encounter other communities, if you encounter other traditions who just by their mere existence threatens the truth of your claims, those traditions subconsciously represent death. They represent nihilism. So what happens in a society that develops the kind of telecommunication technology whereby every single day you open your phone and you are addicted to a process of scrolling through every 7 seconds a new person with new ideas, with different beliefs from all over the world? Do you think that might have something to do with the meaning crisis that we find ourselves in? We're told that what's happened is that people stopped believing in God and now they're all depressed and upset and nihilistic. That's far too simple. You don't think it might have something to do with the fundamentally revolutionary change to our society that has been brought about specifically by telecommunication, by the ability to oftentimes unintentionally and non-consensually be confronted with traditions and people from halfway across the world that just remind you every single day, zing, 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 every single day, that your truth is not the only truth, that the transcendence that you've placed your trust in is completely subjective and personal, and that someone over there believes something totally different and seems to be living just the same kind of happy life. That, I think, is why people are struggling so much. Yeah. It's not just because they're atheists now.
Yeah, I have a lot to say about this. I'll try to keep it compact. By the way, we are aware of all kinds of different options for us spiritually.
Yes.
That doesn't necessarily suggest that none of the options are actually accurate.
I agree.
That are. Okay, so
I'm making a
there
psychological
seems to be an implication there, and this is what creates kind of the angst, because all we have is our own personal, subjective point of view.
I think that's why people experience that. Now, of course, as a matter of truth, you could say, for example, yourself, you could say, yes, I'm constantly confronted by different religious traditions, but I believe that Christianity is true. I think it has the best evidence and whatnot.
This is even true even in the scientific realm. You're
exactly.
all kinds of
that's
different
fine.
ideas, but no one wants to say, just because there are so many different ideas to explain things, that
yes.
nobody can be correct.
Which is why what I'm saying is insensitive to the truth or falsity of any of the traditions. What I'm saying is...
Okay, that's good, because I want to go to that next.
As an explanation as for the psychological phenomenon,
right.
the literal feeling
right.
that people have. Because likewise, you would say that there is a meaning crisis maybe. You would say that lots of people, the statistics we just heard, you would say lots of people, don't feel meaning in their life. And you'd want to offer an explanation for why that's the case. You think their lives are meaningful, right? You think that all of those people who say, my life has no meaning, they're wrong. Their lives actually do have meaning.
Is that what you think?
Well, this was the subjective response. They feel like they don't have meaning, but they were made for a purpose. If they're not in touch with that meaning and purpose, then they're going to feel bereft and adrift.
So you believe there really is a purpose for their life, but subjectively they haven't either found it or they don't feel it.
Yeah.
What I'm doing is I'm offering a psychological explanation for why they don't feel it, which is completely insensitive to whether or not there's a truth of the matter.
I'm so glad you put it that way. Because this is exactly my point, and I don't want anybody to miss it. We're really offering two different pictures of reality here, okay? People have to ask themselves two questions, I think. One is they reflect on their own personal awareness of the need for meaning and significance. Does it seem to them that this is just a psychological thing that people can satisfy in all kinds of different ways depending on the individual? Or does it seem to them, I'm asking these questions because I suspect there is a truth about life that might be discovered, okay? That's the first question. And I think most people's awareness of this is that there's something transcendent, something bigger than them, okay? And any kind of naturalistic explanation is not going to ultimately satisfy that. The other thing is there any reason to believe that there is a transcendent reality, that God exists, that souls exist, that there is an objective morality that guides our life, and if we're living virtuously, that's going to be satisfying even if we don't believe in God or not. Those are the two things at stake here, And now this description, the story of reality I just described that I hold to, it seems to me completely coherent. Maybe not true, but it certainly is coherent that if there is a God who made us for himself and places eternity in our hearts, that we're going to yearn for that and made the way for us to live, and then we're going to find good ways to live as opposed to unsatisfying ways to live. That makes sense. It doesn't make any sense to me at all to say that my molecules are moving in a certain way to create in my conscious mind, which Darwinism cannot offer an explanation for. It hasn't. That's why Daniel Dennett said consciousness is an illusion, because he couldn't do anything with it.